Welcome to the debate. Imagine a brilliant, wealthy physician, a pillar of society, respected by his peers, who discovers a chemical compound in his laboratory that allows him to commit atrocities completely undetected. When we look at this man, are we looking at a tragic victim of a failed medical trial, undone by, a chemical anomaly? Or are we looking at the architect of the perfect crime?
Right, it is the ultimate question of intent versus outcome. When we look at the strange case of Dr. Henry Jekyll, we really have to decide if we are examining a noble pursuit of scientific knowledge that went horribly wrong or, a meticulously planned evasion of moral responsibility.
Yeah, and that is exactly the central question we are analyzing today. We're exploring the true nature and the underlying motivation behind Dr. Jekyll's infamous chemical experiment.
Exactly.
From my perspective, I argue that Dr. Jekyll was a tragic, well-intentioned, scientific visionary. He earnestly sought to cure the human condition of its moral duality through empirical pharmacology. But he was ultimately defeated by a chemical accident, an unrepeatable impurity in his compound, and a terrifying physiological addiction.
Well, and I come at it from a completely opposing view. The scientific framing is, to me, merely a rationalization. I argue that Jekyll was a calculating, profound hypocrite who basically weaponized empirical science merely to indulge his pre-existing dark desires.
You don't think he was trying to cure humanity at all?
No, not at all. He wasn't trying to cure humanity. He was creating a cloak of impunity to protect his highly valued public reputation.
So, to really understand Jekyll, we have to start by taking his own full statement of the case seriously, particularly his deep philosophical reflections on the human condition. Jekyll was not a madman acting on a whim.
Right.
He was an empirical scientist who recognized what he called the hard law of life, the perennial war among our members.
Right, the idea that the human soul is essentially a battleground between our higher aspirations and, our base instincts.
Exactly. This wasn't just a theoretical observation for him. It was an agonizing lived reality. He looked at humanity and saw that we are, burdened by this inherent duality. He wrote that we are forced to bind together what he termed incongruous faggots.
Yeah, which is a very specific choice of words.
Yeah. And for anyone listening today, he's using an old English woodworking and bundling term there. He basically means human nature is like being forced to tie together a clumsy, mismatched bundle of sticks that naturally chafe and rub against one another. It's painful, it causes friction.
It's a vivid image, certainly.
And his experiment was born of a profound, almost utopian aspiration to relieve that friction. He genuinely believed that if he could house these two natures in separate identities, life would be relieved of all that was unbearable.
So he claims.
Well, he believed it. The just could walk securely on their upward path, doing good without being exposed to disgrace by their darker half. And the unjust could be delivered from the remorse of the upright twin. That is a visionary, systemic goal.
I hear you, but
Seeds in the separation, but he is a pioneer stranded in a territory he discovered, ultimately betrayed by a chemical anomaly in his salt that he could never replicate.
See, the problem with taking Jekyll's statement of his own noble intentions at face value is that his endeavor was completely rotten from its inception, long before the potion was ever brewed, long before he set up the variables in that laboratory. Jekyll admits to a profound duplicity of life.
But isn't that just...
Let me finish. He was a man who deeply desired the high social standing, the wealth, and the respect of an elderly Victorian doctor, but he chafed bitterly under the restrictions that such a life required.
But isn't that just the standard human condition? I mean, who doesn't feel that tension?
Not to this extreme. He didn't want to cure humanity. He wanted to have his cake and eat it too. He wanted the prestige of a saint and the indulgence of a sinner. I mean, look at the immediate practical steps he takes once the drug is synthesized.
Okay.
If this is a massive pharmacological breakthrough, he doesn't publish a paper, he doesn't alert the scientific community, or set up a peer review. He explicitly engineers his life to protect his dark side.
You're talking about the logistics he sets up for Edward Hyde.
Precisely. He drafts a will in Hyde's favor, transferring his wealth. He buys a house in the murky, unmonitored district of SoHo. He hires a silent, unscrupulous housekeeper. He sets up a separate bank account.
Well, yes, but
He literally practices sloping his handwriting backward to forge a different signature. This is the calculated, methodical behavior of a premeditating criminal building a bulletproof alibi. It's not the behavior of a detached scientist pursuing the elevation of mankind.
I hear that, but we have to look at the physical, biological evidence of Jekyll's baseline goodness, which the text explicitly provides. When the experiment first succeeds, why is Edward Hyde so much smaller, slighter, and younger than Henry Jekyll?
Because he's a concentrated fragment of the whole.
But it's more than that. Jekyll theorizes quite convincingly from a biological standpoint that his evil side was less robust and less developed because his life had been, up to that point, 9/10 a life of effort, virtue, and control.
9/10. Right.
Hyde proves that Jekyll was fundamentally a good man whose evil side had atrophied from lack of use. If his motivation was purely to unleash a dormant monster, the monster would have been of equal or greater stature from the start.
Look, I'm sorry, but I just don't buy that. Let me tell you why.
Okay, go ahead.
The physical stature of Hyde, at the beginning, might reflect a historical lack of exercise of his worst impulses. Sure, yes, but Jekyll's psychological reaction to becoming Hyde completely betrays his true intent.
How so?
In that very first transformation, he describes feeling exulting in the freshness of the sensations. He is delighted by the knowledge that he is tenfold more wicked, sold a slave to my original evil.
Well, the drug is intoxicating.
But he explicitly compares the feeling to wine. A man who truly wishes to liberate the good within himself, who views this as a noble medical trial, would be horrified by this pure concentration of malice. Instead, Jekyll revels in it.
I mean, it's a new sensation.
He explicitly boasts that while men have previously hired bravos, or, hitmen, to transact their crimes, while their reputations sat under shelter, he was the first man to ever do so for his own pleasures. He created Hyde to be a hitman for his own repressed vices.
I see why you think that, but let me give you a different perspective. I want to try a thought experiment here.
All right.
Consider a brilliant nuclear physicist who is desperately attempting to harness endless, clean energy to save the world. During a trial, he accidentally creates a devastating runaway chain reaction, a weapon.
Okay.
The intention was liberation, even if the result was hellish.
I follow the analogy.
Right, so Jekyll was trying to free the polar twins in the human consciousness. The drug itself had no discriminating action. He notes it was neither diabolical nor divine. It merely shook the doors of the prison house of his disposition.
But what walked out of that prison house?
Because his virtue slumbered at that specific moment and his evil was kept awake by ambition, the thing that emerged was Hyde. But the intent of the mechanism was neutral separation. It was an empirical pursuit of truth that yielded an unintended, catastrophic byproduct.
I appreciate the nuclear physicist analogy, but it breaks down on one crucial point.
Which is?
The physicist doesn't look at the atomic bomb, feel a leap of welcome, and then immediately set up a secret bank account to fund more bombings.
Fair point.
But wait, if we assume for a moment his initial intent was pure, how do we explain the actual execution? Once the separation happens, the dynamic between the two identities shifts completely. Let's look at the unfolding reality of this experiment. The separation wasn't neutral, and it certainly wasn't symmetrical.
I have to admit, I do struggle with this part of the mechanics. If the drug is neutral, how does it know to only isolate the evil aspects of his personality? Why didn't he ever drink the potion and transform into an angel of pure good?
Exactly. The experiment failed its own basic premise. Hyde was pure evil, yes. But Jekyll was not pure good. Jekyll was still the composite man. He was still the same mix of good and evil he had always been.
So the separation was incomplete?
Completely incomplete. Jekyll didn't isolate the good so it could walk securely upward. He only isolated the bad, handing it the steering wheel while keeping the composite Jekyll safe in his handsome square to enjoy the social benefits.
He retained his original form, yes.
And he exploited that. He tells himself it was Hyde after all, and Hyde alone that was guilty. He uses this to let his conscience slumber.
He wakes up to his good qualities seemingly unimpaired, rushing out to do acts of philanthropy just to balance the cosmic scales.
He was trying to make amends.
As he notes, Jekyll had more than a father's interest in Hyde's activities, while Hyde had a son's indifference. He sat safely in his study, steering this creature by proxy, enjoying the vicarious depravity. That is not an unintended byproduct. That is a man piloting an avatar of his own malice.
That's an interesting point, though I would frame it differently. I don't think he's just comfortably piloting an avatar. The realization of that severe asymmetry is exactly what triggers his profound horror and his desperate attempt to course correct. The turning point isn't intellectual, it's biological. It's when the transformation becomes involuntary.
Oh, you mean the incident with the hand?
Yes. He goes to sleep as Henry Jekyll, and he wakes up in his own bedroom, looks down and sees the lean, corded, swarthy hand of Edward Hyde lying on the sheets. If you're listening to this today, you might immediately recognize Jekyll's symptoms as classic chemical dependency.
Withdrawals and tolerance, right?
Exactly. He builds a tolerance, he suffers withdrawals. The sheer icy terror of that moment proves his conscience was not dead. At that crossroad, he makes a definitive moral choice to stop taking the drug. He bids a resolute farewell to the liberty of Hyde. For 2 entire months, he lives a life of severe virtue and philanthropy.
He does. I'll give you that.
He is attempting to undo the damage, showing that the intellectual scientist within him recognized the empirical failure of the experiment and sought to contain the fallout.
The tragedy is that the physiological mechanism he set in motion could no longer be stopped by willpower alone.
He lived a life of severe virtue for 2 months, yes. But let's look at the infrastructure of that virtue. Let's talk about the mechanics of how he actually handled that supposed repentance.
Okay. He tells us he chose the elderly doctor surrounded by friends. But he makes a very telling admission. He made this choice with an unconscious reservation.
Meaning he left a back door open.
A literal and metaphorical back door. During those 2 months of abstinence, he never gave up the lease on the house in SoHo. He never destroyed the clothes of Edward Hyde that lay ready in his cabinet. He kept the entire infrastructure of his vice perfectly intact.
But couldn't that just be the hesitation of an addict? Letting go is incredibly hard.
It's deeper than that. By keeping the SoHo house and the clothes, he is creating a psychological permission structure. He isn't curing his dark side, he is merely caging it while ensuring he still holds the key. And this directly causes the culmination of his struggle, the brutal murder of Sir Danvers Carew.
The Carew murder is horrific, absolutely. But it is the ultimate proof of the failure of the pharmacology, not a premeditated act of the man. Jekyll did not set out that night to kill anyone.
He was ready to be Hyde, though.
But he was just sitting on a bench in Regent's Park enjoying a clear January day, and he simply had a momentary, vainglorious thought. He was comparing his active goodwill to the lazy cruelty of his neighbors.
A moment of arrogance.
Right, a normal human failing, a moment of pride. But because of his profound chemical dependency, that minor moral slip triggered an involuntary transformation. The animal within had grown in stature through previous indulgence.
Well,
the murder was a spontaneous eruption of a physiological addiction that had hijacked his biology. It was an involuntary spasm of a diseased system.
that's a compelling argument. But have you considered the psychological mechanics of repression at play here? It wasn't just a chemical spasm. It was the explosive, direct result of his hypocrisy.
How do you mean?
Because he kept the SoHo house, because he kept the clothes, he was stripping himself of all the balancing instincts that ordinary people use to navigate temptation. If we think about the modern concept of compartmentalizing toxic behavior, where someone acts perfectly professional at work but is a monster behind closed doors, Jekyll took that to a literal extreme.
So the repression itself acted as a pressure cooker?
Exactly. As he says himself, my devil had been long caged, he came out roaring. The brutal, insensate clubbing of Carew, where he mauled an unresisting body and tasted delight from every blow, was not a chemical accident. It was the inevitable result of the Victorian hypocrite's attempt to oppress and completely compartmentalize his own nature.
But notice what happens immediately after the murder. The veil of self-indulgence is completely rent. He falls to his knees with streaming tears of gratitude and remorse. He locks the door to the laboratory, crushes the key under his heel, and embraces the restrictions of natural life with willing humility.
Sure,
out of fear.
He labors to relieve suffering. He becomes a prisoner in his own home, not because he's a criminal hiding from the law, but because he's terrified of his own biology.
Terrified of getting caught, I would argue.
No, terrified of what his body is doing without his consent. He writes that he is eaten up and emptied by fever, solely occupied by the horror of his other self. He is a man desperately searching for the pure salt, the chemical cure, ransacking all of London for it. He is a victim of an impurity in the original batch of salt. If the pharmacology had been sound, if that initial variable hadn't been flawed, the tragedy would not have occurred. He is ultimately a prisoner of empirical science's fallibility.
See, the frantic search for the salt is just the ultimate manifestation of his refusal to accept moral responsibility.
You don't think the salt is the literal key to the formula?
I think it's a brilliant metaphor for his delusion. He is looking for a chemical solution to a spiritual rot. And notice the petty, ape-like tricks Hyde plays on Jekyll in those final days, scrawling blasphemies in Jekyll's books, burning his father's portrait. The hatred between them is mutual, but it stems from the exact same core of supreme selfishness.
They're chained together in that cabinet.
Right. Hyde fears the gallows. Jekyll loathes the despondency and the loss of his reputation. Even at the very end, as Jekyll writes his final statement, he wonders if Hyde will die upon the scaffold or find the courage to release himself. He says, "I am careless. This is my true hour of death."
A total collapse.
He pities himself. He has entirely destroyed his own identity, not because of an impure salt, but because he dared to think he could play God with his own soul and avoid the bill coming due.
It is a terrifying cautionary tale. When we step back and look at the entirety of the text, I still see the tragic intersection of immense intellectual ambition and the inherent limitations of physical science. Jekyll sought to solve the ultimate philosophical problem of humanity, our divided nature, using the crude empirical tools of chemistry.
He tried to put morality in a test tube.
Precisely, and he succeeded just enough to ruin himself. He was trapped by a chemical anomaly, an unrepeatable impurity in a batch of salt that left him a permanent prisoner in his own cabinet, frantic and deteriorating. His intentions were to liberate mankind from the agony of remorse and the constant struggle of temptation.
Yeah.
Instead, he proved that the core identity of a human being cannot be physically dismantled without catastrophic biological and psychological collapse.
The tragedy is undeniably profound, but I maintain it is entirely of Jekyll's own moral making. The text brilliantly exposes the self-delusion of the Victorian gentleman, and really of any human being in any era, who believes he can dabble in pure, unrestrained evil without it eventually consuming his entire identity.
Right.
Jekyll thought he could neatly sever his responsibilities from his desires. He thought he could wear a thick cloak of impunity.
He thought the evil would remain subordinate.
Yes, but he discovered that evil is not a passive element you can just store in a jar. It is active, it is ravenous, and it grows when fed. The failure was not in the beaker. The failure was in the hubris of a man who wanted the wages of sin without paying the tax of a guilty conscience.
Yet, despite our differing views on his initial culpability, we must acknowledge a shared, chilling conclusion that the source material forces upon us. We see the true weight of this experiment most clearly, not through Jekyll, but through his colleague, Dr. Lanyon.
Oh, Lanyon. Absolutely.
Lanyon is a grounded, rational, empirical man of medicine. He represents the sanity of the scientific establishment. And when he witnesses the transformation, when he actually sees Hyde drink the potion and swell and melt back into Henry Jekyll, it literally kills him.
It does. Lanyon's death from sheer terror is the ultimate proof of the experiment's unnaturalness. Lanyon says his life is shaken to its roots, that his soul sickened at it. He cannot mentally process the reality unveiled to him.
It breaks his mind before it breaks his body.
Seeing the physical manifestation of unalloyed evil housed within a respected colleague is fatal to a healthy mind.
It suggests that our duality, as painful as it is, as much of a perennial war as it causes every single day, is structurally necessary for our survival. To break it is to break the very foundation of human existence. Analyzing historical texts like this through both a strict scientific lens
any rigorous psychological framework provides immense value.
Definitely.
It challenges our assumptions about the motives behind discovery and the limits of human intervention.
Absolutely. And there are so many more layers in this material to explore, particularly regarding the intense pressure of societal reputation versus the messy reality of private truth. The architecture of Jekyll's life, the handsome, respectable house out front with the secret, sordid, decaying back door in the alley, remains a perfect, enduring metaphor for the human condition.
It leaves us to consider our own mismatched bundles of sticks, our own internal friction, and to decide for ourselves where the well-intentioned Dr. Jekyll truly ends and the monstrous Mr. Hyde truly begins. It seems we always return to that image of the pristine laboratory. We want to believe the science is clean, the motivations are pure, and the waters are crystal clear. But the moment you look closely, you realize the laboratory was built over the sewer all along.